which we hope and expect will become an annual event. The theme of this year's symposium, From Dung to Dollars, the Political Economy of China's Rise, could hardly be more topical or more important. The media provides daily reports, often it seems sensationalist, about the Chinese economy and the geopolitical impact of its rapid growth. The coverage, unfortunately, is often superficial, leading most Americans to fear China more than understand it. Today, we expect to address that problem, at least in part. We are fortunate to have with us 3 visiting scholars with vast experience in their fields. Ezra Vogel, an emeritus professor in the social sciences from Harvard and author of Deng Xiaoping and the Transformation of China. Yaxing Huang, a professor of Chinese economy and business from MIT's Sloan School. And Scott Rozelle, a senior fellow in international studies from Stanford. We will also benefit from the expertise of Middlebury faculty members Eric Bleich, director of the International Politics and Economics program and a professor of political science, economist Will Pyle, and Sarah Straub and Jessica Tietz, both from the Department of Political Science. In addition, we will hear today from 3 accomplished and well-traveled Middlebury students, all seniors and IP&E majors, who also spent part of their Middlebury careers studying at the CV Star Middlebury School in China. Those students who will chair today's panel discussions are Julia Deutsch, who studied in Kunming and interned this past summer with an NGO in China and last summer with the State Department, Kara Myers, who studied in Hangzhou and took part in a National Science Foundation project that researched water use and scarcity in China, and Catherine de Sutter, who has studied both in Kunming and in Buenos Aires, and this past summer completed a Monterey Middlebury internship analyzing a Nature Conservancy microfinance project through Ecologia. With these visiting and resident scholars as our guides, we will learn more about how China, beginning with Deng Xiaoping in the late 1970s, has remade itself into the economic leviathan that recently passed Japan to become the world's 2nd largest economy. We will hear about the China model and how it mixes top-down leadership and local experimentation with great financial resources and the willingness to take a long view of economic success. We'll also get a better understanding of whether or how China's burgeoning economy poses a threat to the United States. While the U.S. economy still dwarfs China's, a recent Pew Research Center survey found that 78% of Americans say the large amount of U.S. debt held by China represents a serious problem, while solid majorities found the outsourcing of jobs to Chinese manufacturers and the U.S. trade gap with China, a record $280 billion last year, as worrisome issues. The relationship between the U.S. and China continues to be a hot-button political issue as well. The issue of trade, especially, has been visible on the campaign trail in recent days. The Obama administration filed a complaint earlier this week with the World Trade Organization alleging that China has illegally subsidized automotive exports and undercut American suppliers. Some say this move was politically motivated. Mitt Romney responded by promising, if elected, to label China as a currency manipulator and place tariffs on the country's exports to the United States. The Democrats claim that a trade war could erupt between the 2 economic powers under a Romney administration. Today's discussions promise to help us better separate policy from bluster and learn more about likely future relations between the 2 countries. We look forward to this symposium and today's sessions and the opportunity to learn much more about China, its economy, its politics, and its place in the world. I welcome our guest speakers to the college and thank them for sharing their expertise and wisdom with us. It is now my pleasure to turn things over to Eric Bleich, Director of the International Politics and Economics Program and our host for the day. Eric?
Thank you, Ron. Good afternoon. I'm Eric Bleich, as Ron has just told you, and I want to say just a couple of words before we start officially. First of all, I'm very happy to welcome all of you, and in particular our guest speakers today. This is the first annual International Politics and Economics Symposium, and what does that mean? Well, it means that we in the program have wanted to highlight the importance of the issues surrounding international political economy for our campus and for the wider world, and we're going to be inviting speakers on an annual basis to come and help us think about some of the most important issues that the global community faces in the contemporary world. And we could not have asked for a better topic or for a better set of speakers than we have with us today. And for this, we are indebted to the hard work of the symposium committee, Professors Will Pyle and Shoshana Kakobian of the Economics Department, and Professors Sarah Stroup and Jessica Tietz of the Political Science Department. They are the team that selected the topic, that recruited the speakers, and along with our student chairs, they are going to help guide us through the intellectually exciting parts of the day. There are other aspects to the symposium for which we should also give thanks, and some people may find these exciting too. Most importantly, I want to thank Martha Baldwin and Charlotte Tate of the IP&E program and the Rowatton Center for International Affairs. They've been central and indispensable from the administrative end. I'd also like to thank facility services, dining services, the staff of the Commons, college communications, and library and information services for their contributions. And in particular, it's worth noting that this event is being live streamed so that our broader Middlebury and Monterey community can take part from afar. So welcome to those who are watching online. And when I mentioned this to one of our undergraduates who's abroad in Argentina this semester, he responded in an email, boom, score one for the good guys. So there's some excitement for you. And of course, this event would also not be possible without the generous support of many groups on campus. Major funding comes not only from the program in International Politics and Economics, but also from the C.A. Johnson Economics Fund, from the Rowatton Center for International Affairs, from the Academic Enrichment Fund, and from the program in East Asian Studies. The departments of Chinese, Geography, History, and Political Science, as well as Atwater, Brainerd, and Cook Commons, also provided significant funding and support for this event. So thank you to everyone whose sponsorship has made this day possible. Before I turn over the podium to Julia to get things started, I have to put on my crowd control manager hat to let you know that there are 3 exits to this room. The one you came in, there's another one over here, and there's one around the corner in the back. Also, please turn off your cell phones if you haven't done that already. And finally, I want to note 2 things which you will probably also pick up on as you sit here for a while and listen. The first is that we already are a pretty big crowd. We're going to be probably an even bigger crowd, and we have short coffee breaks. So the combination of these 2 things means that we have asked the chairs to be strict in their enforcement of the time limits, and I'd ask the people in the audience, if you step out to get a cup of coffee, that you are sure to be back before the next panel starts. And remember that this evening's session will take place not here, but in By Hall 216 from 7:15 to 8:30. With all that in mind, let me re-extend my welcome to you and to our speakers and turn over the podium to Julia. Julia.
Welcome, everyone, to the first annual International Politics and Economics Program Symposium. My name is Julia Deutsch, and I am a senior IP&E major and just returned from 8 months of study in China. Before I introduce our guest speaker today, let me take a moment to describe the format of today's talks. We have 3 speakers presenting on different aspects of China. Each of our speakers will speak from about 35 to 40 minutes. We will then follow this with a Q&A session. For this first panel, Professor Sarah Stroup from the Political Science Department and IP&E program will serve as the moderator. We will end this session promptly at 1:45 and have a quick coffee break before moving to our next panel. It is now my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Ezra Vogel. Professor Vogel is the Henry Ford Professor of the Social Sciences Emeritus at Harvard University. Over his distinguished career, Professor Vogel has been a leader in the academic study of East Asia and a noted contributor to American policy in the region. Trained as a sociologist, Professor Vogel has been traveling to and publishing on both China and Japan for the past 5 decades. Among his numerous publications on Japan, the Japanese edition of his 1979 book, Japan as #1, Lessons for America, is the all-time bestseller in Japan of nonfiction by a Western author. Professor Vogel's first book on China, Canton Under Communism, won the Harvard University Press Faculty Book of the Year Award in 1969. In 1987, the Guangdong provincial government invited him to examine 10 years of economic reform in the province, yielding another important work, One Step Ahead in China. His study of Chinese political and economic reform has culminated in his epic 2011 biography of Deng Xiaoping, a work that illuminates the life of one of China's most influential leaders. President Jimmy Carter called it an impressive and important biography of one of the most important men of the 20th century. At Harvard, Professor Vogel has been lauded by his many students as an enthusiastic and thoughtful advisor. He has twice served as the director of the Fairbanks Center for East Asia Research and was the first director of the Asia Center from 1997 through 1999. Professor Vogel's scholarship and professional network has informed U.S. policy in East Asia. He served as the National Intelligence Officer for East Asia at the National Intelligence Council from 1993 through 1995. He also worked with a number of public affairs groups to advance knowledge and public interest in East Asia. He officially retired from teaching in 2000, but has continued an active professional life as researcher and advisor. Professor Vogel has graciously agreed to launch this first symposium of the International Politics and Economics program at Middlebury College. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ezra Vogel.
Thank you very much, Julia. It's a great pleasure to be back at Middlebury. I consider myself a special friend of Middlebury ever since John Berningshausen over 3 decades ago set up this slave training program in introductory Chinese language for the college, and has maintained and turned out so many wonderful people, and it's been a pleasure to come back every few years and visit Middlebury. I think you're very lucky to have a president who already is an undergraduate at Bucknell, already took courses on China, and who has a special interest in East Asia. And I want to thank all the other people, Eric Bleish, Jessica Tietz, Sarah Stroop, and others who played such an important role in setting up today's program. In the year 2000, when I turned 70, I was trying to decide what I wanted to do when I grew up. And I had the choice then of continuing teaching. As you know, we faculty aren't required to retire unless we prove legally that we're so incompetent. And it was hard to prove that. But I decided that as much as I love teaching, that I thought I had a special obligation as somebody who had a lot of privilege and contacts in China to try to do what I could to contribute last few years of my academic work to understanding how China went through the transition. I know that in the decades ahead, there's probably going to be no more important issue than coming to terms with the rise of China. And I felt that if I could help understand how it happened and what the roots and what some of the underlying structures were that were created by this transition, that it would be an academic contribution. I had special privilege at Harvard of having children of some of the elite and having had many contacts so that I could have special contacts for interviews, and I wanted to use that fully. I didn't realize at the time, I thought of maybe spending 5 years. I didn't realize I was going to end up spending 10 years. But I spent 10 years in describing and focusing on the one person who led that. Like many social scientists, I believe the underlying structures and forces are very important, but also I think during certain times of transition, there can be cases where certain leaders have unusually power and flexibility, and their personal character and inclinations do a great deal to shape how China became And I was surprised in the year 2000 there hadn't been many people who worked on Deng Xiaoping. There were a lot of books on Mao. There were some works on Deng, but nothing in a very comprehensive nature. And so I decided that I wanted to do everything I could. I never got to know Deng. I'm envious of those who did. I was at his coming out party in January 1979 when he came to the United States, and we had a reception for him, and I was able to see him fairly close at a reception, but I was never able to engage him personally. But I did spend 10 years figuring out every way I could. In retrospect, I think I was very lucky in many ways. One is that it took me so long to write the book. Because if I had written it too quickly, it came out too quickly, nobody would want to look at it. And I think after 1989, because Deng had put down the Tiananmen incident, he had such a bad reputation around the world that people didn't want to look at him. The analogy I use is if you look at somebody like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, they were terrible in the fact that they were slave owners. That's a very inhumane thing to do. And it was a blot on their character and on their worldview. But if you say, does that explain their historical role? I think no, it does not explain their historical role. And you have to understand that even though they have that blot on their career, that they could still play a very important historical role. And I think Deng was the same way. He did put down the demonstrations in 1989. People were killed on the street through a command that he supported. And yet, I think for changing the way a nation behaved and for impacting on the world, I personally believe there's no leader in the 20th century who had a bigger impact on the world than Deng Xiaoping. When he came to power, the average per capita income was less than $100. The country was in a mess after the Cultural Revolution, was deeply divided. There was no real opening to the outside world. There were almost zero students from China studying in the West. And Deng guided this transition. And so what I want to do today is give you a bunch of pictures that sort of show and call attention to some of the key aspects of Deng's career. Let's see. I'm afraid that I'm going to have to somehow turn. Okay, I will try to look at the audience and the pictures at the same time. Here's the first picture we have of Deng Xiaoping. Oh, could I look at that? That's perfect. Oh, that's great. That way I can sort of keep. So when the first picture we have of Deng, when he was 16 years old, he had already gone to France. He was born in Sichuan, in the southwest part of the country, in a village in Guang'an County, and he had some ancestors who were high officials in the Qing, and there was no question that his father thought that becoming a high official was very important. When he came to start school, he was born in 1904. So he was starting school. It was just on the eve of the 1911 revolution, and they had just abolished the traditional entrance examinations for officials. And so he had to get prepared for a new era. And his father helped him go to a special preparatory class in Chongqing, which has become famous the last few months because of the leader, Bo Xilai, getting in a little trouble. And so in that city, Deng Xiaoping spent a year getting ready to go to France, and in 1920, he arrived in France. In 1919, he was at Guang'an Middle School, public middle school, and he had already taken part in the May 4th demonstrations. And so he had already become a very deep patriot before he left. The idea was when they went to France that the bright students from Sichuan, and there were others from other provinces, but Sichuan business leaders made a special effort to get people from their province. The idea was that because they didn't have enough money to pay their way to get into universities, that they would work part-time and work in factories, earn money, and then they could go to the universities the rest of the time. And in 1923, one of the first pictures we have was of the Young Communist Youth League. Right in the middle there, you see a man who was about 6 years older than Deng, ONeill, who was kind of the informal leader. These people who had gone to France, of course, were well selected. They later became communists, but they were not the poorest. They were the vanguard. In order to get education, to pass the exams to get to France, they had to come from families that were fairly well-to-do, either landlords or business people. And when they got to France, they found out that the jobs in the factories were not there. They had made the calculations of the opportunities for jobs during World War I when there were a lot of job opportunities. But what they hadn't thought through was that a lot of French soldiers who survived the war would be coming back and taking those jobs. And they also didn't understand that there would be a depression in 1919, 1920. So that by the time they arrived in France, there were almost no factory jobs, and the jobs that they were there were really at the worst. So what they found out was they could not earn enough money to go to university, so they did not go to university. They remained workers, and they could see around them that a lot of rich people lived very comfortably, and a lot of French workers were starving and living on terrible conditions, and that they were especially observant that the people from foreign countries like China were treated even worse than local workers. And when they tried to understand what was going on, and they began reading about the Russian Revolution, which had just taken place in 1917 on the eve of their arrival, when they began reading about what Karl Marx had written about rich people exploiting the workers and imperialists exploiting the developing countries, it made eminent sense. And so they bonded together and formed this Young Communist League. And at a time when the Communist Party was just barely getting started in China, there were less than 1,000 members of the Chinese Communist Party altogether, and some of them were in this group in France. Later on, in the World War II, these people did not necessarily play an important role back in China. But when you needed people to guide the economy, the technology, these people with foreign experience played a very key role. And so in this little group that was in Europe together, 1923-24, in addition to Zhou Enlai, who led foreign policy, you have Li Fuchun, who led the first 5-year plan. And you also have Ye Rongzhen, who led modern science and technology, who played such a key role. So among this important group that bonded in France to form a radical group that would be part of the leaders who would be the vanguard of the movement of ordinary workers to take power, these people bonded and would play a very key role. Deng was in France for 5 years, and although he never attended universities, he was observant and got to see what went on in factories and learned a great deal about modern science and technology. So compared to Mao, who had never been abroad before he came to power, who read ancient books but had no sense of the modern realities, Deng had lived and understood and had worked with other people who were coming to terms with what was going on around the world. So Deng was lucky in the fact that he had much better sense of the outside world, and after he returned from France, he could read reports of international situation and have a much better understanding of what was going on than those who had not been abroad without those experiences. After 1952, when Deng was transferred from the Southwest, where he had been in charge of the Southwest Bureau of 6 provinces, to Beijing, he played a very important role, and it was picked up by Mao as one of the most promising young people who might become his successor. So he was trained not only in domestic affairs, but in foreign affairs. And of course, the foreign affairs in the 1950s were primarily with the Soviet Union. So here we are, Deng Xiaoping with Mao in Moscow in 1957. When Mao pointed out, and he said, "See that little guy over there? He is going to play a very important role. He has a very big future." He was already thinking of Deng Xiaoping. In 1960, Deng is in the Soviet Union. Here he is meeting with Khrushchev. He also was in Moscow in 1956 at the 20th Party Congress when Khrushchev denounced Stalin. And already at that time, Deng could see that the total denunciation of all people who worked with Stalin just devastated the party and the respect the party had, and that it was almost impossible to govern after that. And that if China ever went through a situation where they had to have a criticism of leaders, it would never be so devastating that it destroyed the authority of the party. You could criticize and point out difficulties, but never be so totally devastating as Khrushchev's devastating attack on Stalin in 1956. In the 1950s and 60s, Deng saw a lot of other leaders from other parts of the communist world. And here's an example of Ho Chi Minh, who happened to have been in France in the early 1920s at the same time that Deng was. This is 1963, and Deng is off. They've had a series of nasty letters between the Soviet Union and China, telling about all the horrible things the other did. And Mao sent Deng to carry on those negotiations and arguments in Moscow. Here he is at the airport leaving in 1963 to go to Moscow and being seen off by Liu Shaoqi, Zhou Enlai, and Peng Zhen and others. If Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese leaders and his family claim he was 5 feet tall. Some others say he was really only 4 feet 11. So he was not the tallest of the Chinese leaders. But if you look at him here, he doesn't seem to be suffering from an inferiority complex. Here is a guy who already at 4 feet 11 or 5 feet tall had been carrying on arguments. He was a bright guy. He had been a military commander, political commissar for over 12 years, and he had expected orders to be followed while he was in the army. And he had served as Secretary General of the party for many years, and he had a great deal of confidence. Foreign leaders who met Deng were impressed that he seemed to have a natural confidence that was quite different from a lot of other Chinese and Soviet leaders. In the Cultural Revolution, Mao decided that Deng was not radical enough and was not doing enough to support the total mass movements and the continuing class warfare that he wanted to continue. Deng wanted to make the Communist Party a ruling party, and it looked as if after the 1956 Eighth Party Congress that might happen, but Mao insisted on getting rid of Deng and Liu Shaoqi and others who didn't stand for that continuing revolution. So from 1966 in the Cultural Revolution until 1973, Deng was down in the countryside. He was out of power, and the last 4 years he was down the countryside in Jiangxi. And in Jiangxi, I think Deng had an opportunity to think about what he might do to change China if he returned to power. He was down there isolated. One of the specialists on leadership at Harvard that I talked to is a man named David Gergen, who served several presidents, who pointed out to me that Churchill had after he had had high positions, was banished, and had a chance while banished to think about what he would do. De Gaulle had the same experience. Lincoln had the same experience. A number of people who had high positions who then were lost their power and were banished had a chance while out of power to think more deeply about what are the things that are really important. And I think in this period of 1969 to 73, when Deng was down there in Jiangxi, he had a chance to think more deeply about what was really important, what he would do to change after he came if he came back to Beijing and had new opportunities. This, to me, is a very poignant picture at a very poignant time. The person who really built up foreign relations in China was Deng's old leader, Zhou Enlai, who had led him in Paris and who had led him in the underground in Shanghai some of the years in the 1930s when he was there. But in 1974, Zhou Enlai already had cancer and was not in the greatest of health. In 1971, China was voted in to take the seat in the United Nations, replacing Taiwan. And a Chinese leader had the opportunity to go to New York to address the General Assembly. It was a great honor, of course, to represent the country. And Zhou Enlai should have been the one who received that honor. But Zhou Enlai not only had physical illness, he also had political illness. Mao was very upset that Zhou Enlai had not done more to stand up against the United States, was too soft on Kissinger and Nixon, and so was quite critical of Zhou Enlai. So Zhou Enlai was not allowed to go to New York to address the United Nations. Zhou Enlai passed the mantle on to Deng Xiaoping, and here they are at the airport as Deng is about to go to fly to the United Nations to give the first speech representing sort of communist China and what their role would be in the United Nations. Here Deng is delivering that. Here he is up close giving that speech in 1974, the first great speech representing China in the United Nations. Part of what I'm sort of trying to make the point is that by the time Deng came to power in 1978, he had already had a lot of experience in international relations in the Soviet world, in dealing with the third world countries in the United Nations, in serving as an apprentice under Zhou Enlai. So that by the time he came to power in 78, he was a very experienced, thoughtful person, and he'd had several years down in the countryside to think about that. While he was in New York, he met for the first time Henry Kissinger, and as they joked, Deng was not quite available in 1972 when Nixon came to China. He was down in the countryside, out of power. Henry Kissinger said at the time that Deng seemed to be on a training mission. Kissinger loved Zhou Enlai. He thought he was a marvelous, remarkable person. And he found that he was so subtle and so interesting. And he felt that Deng was quite stiff and was therefore just learning the ropes. I think it's not, Henry's comments are not completely fair, because I think that at the time, Deng was also very worried about what Mao was thinking. He'd just come back to power. Mao had thrown him out of power during the Cultural Revolution, and he was very cautious, and therefore could not be spontaneous, could not show off his knowledge. And so when he first started out dealing with foreign affairs in 1974, and was really in charge over the next year or two in dealing with foreign affairs under Zhou Enlai's tutelage, he had to be somewhat cautious because Mao was still in power. Here we have Deng coming back in 1977. He was not only thrown out of power during the Cultural Revolution, but in late 75, early 76, as Mao was pretty clearly on his deathbed and had only a few months to live, Mao again decided that Deng was not committed enough to the radical cause of class struggle to leave as a successor. He'd thought of Deng as a successor, but in the end he didn't think he was radical enough. So Deng was again thrown out of power, and then in September 76, Mao passes away, and Deng is out of power, and Vogel is in charge. And the question is whether Deng should be allowed to come back to work. A lot of people felt that he'd had such experience and knowledge and was so able that he ought to come back. When he came back, he was allowed to come back about a year after Mao died, in August 1977. The first thing he did, he volunteered to be responsible for education, science, and technology, because he felt of all the modernizations in industry and agriculture and national defense, that none was more important than science and technology. And that by revising and modernizing science and technology, that he could get ready for China's effort to modernize. And since Mao had died in 1976, a lot of Chinese leaders felt that this was a real opportunity now for China to begin to modernize. And Deng felt that the basis of modernization lay in science, technology, and education. So he called the educators together. The universities had been closed down basically for 10 years during the Cultural Revolution. And Deng said to them, the Minister of Education, other education leaders, he said, can we open the universities this year? And can we have entrance examinations based on quality? Can we do that this year? And they pointed out all the difficulties why it was virtually impossible. And Deng said finally, he says, is it possible? And he said, well, it is possible, but it's very difficult. Deng says, we're going to do it. And so in 1977, at this education conference, Deng said, we're going to start entrance examinations. Now, they had some entrance examinations in the 60s before universities, but Mao always believed that politics should be in command, and that not only merit as measured by exams was important, but political attitudes were very important. But in 1977, Deng said, everybody has okay political attitudes. They're all Chinese. We don't have a landlord class anymore. We don't have a bourgeois class anymore. And anybody who has the examination ability, by passing the exams, they can go to universities. And so they started university entrance examinations in the fall of '77, which provided the kind of underlying rationale for what you have leaders. And compared to Chinese history, where officials had passed exams, these exams covered many more areas. It was not just to train government officials, but in all kinds of areas. But it was very much in the view, in the traditional view, that there ought to be a merit measure for getting ahead. And so they made that as the measure for getting ahead. And here in 1977, we have a meeting with Yang Zhenming. Deng felt that science and technology was so important that he wanted to do everything he could to modernize. And he had a shortcut, an advantage that a lot of other countries didn't. And that is that there were Chinese who had gone abroad in the late 40s who were distinguished in the field of science and technology. There were 3 Chinese Americans at the time who had won the Nobel Prize in science. One was Yang Zhenming. Here is Deng meeting with Yang Zhenming. One was Samuel Ting of MIT. Here he is meeting with Samuel Ting. One of them was Li Zhengdao of Columbia, and here he is meeting with him. So by having frequent meetings with these Chinese Americans who could speak to Deng in Chinese and who knew the situation in China, they could give advice about what China needed to do for science and technology. So even before December 1978, when Deng came to power, he had already begun to lay the basis in science and technology. In the summer of 1978, the presidential advisor for science went to China, and Frank Press, who was an MIT professor in earth science, and Deng pressed him and said, can we if we normalize relations this fall and complete that, We will be ready to send students to the United States. Can you take hundreds of students right away? And can you take tens of thousands of students in the next few years? Press didn't feel that he could answer. And when I interviewed Carter about this, Carter said that Press called him and woke him up at 3 a.m. in the morning and said, what do I answer Deng about being able to send students abroad? And Carter said, I told him to go ahead. And so he told Deng, yes, we can begin to accept those. I think what's interesting from the point of view of understanding Deng is how intense he was about pushing that agenda and how important science, technology, based education was to preparing for moving ahead. He saw also a lot of other languages, a lot of other Chinese faculty who had been abroad. One of them, the reason I show this picture is John Berninghouse and some others can appreciate, is Jiao Yanren, who was a famous linguist, had a daughter named Iris Bien, who made me suffer through beginning Chinese at Harvard, and was our language teacher there, and was one tough cookie, the same spirit as John Berninghouse in imposing students that they better study and they better know their lessons. Of course, Deng played a crucial role. Of course, he couldn't have done this without broader support. And I think that one thing I'm surprised that other scholars have not made more of is a very important mission led by Gumu, a vice premier, to Europe in summer of 1978. Because when I interviewed about this in China, all the people I talked to said absolutely central, absolutely critical. Those of you who worked on Japan remember that there was a famous Iwakura mission that spent 21 months actually going abroad at the beginning of early Meiji period, and it learned and sort of set the pattern for study abroad. And China did not have one that long, and they sent several missions abroad, but none was more important than this 5-week Gumu trip to Switzerland, Germany, France, Belgium, and Holland. And like the Iwakura mission, they divided up into specialties, and they got all kinds of training programs. And they were able to visit scientific academies. So when they came back, they were to report immediately to Politburo members in Beijing, and they made the presentation. The meeting started at 3. Most people expected it to last an hour or two. It went from 3 p.m. to midnight. And one of the Chinese who took part said it was such an amazing meeting because we realized that we had been wrong. We had been putting out what amounted to propaganda, saying how well China was doing, and they were in fact far, far behind. But they also found out that the European countries were ready to help them, provide scholarships, give science and technological aid. And so instead of being discouraged, they were much more optimistic about things that could be done by opening up. So in December 78, when Deng ascended to become the preeminent leader and took Hua Guofeng's place and was brought into that position, they already had an understanding that they could learn a lot from foreign countries, and they would send science and technology. And this Gumu trip provided very critical, broader support among high-level leaders that they needed to have that kind of perspective. Here's Deng talking to Gumu. And here we are at the Central Party Work Conference in December 1978, when a number of leaders decided that Hua Guofeng was not up to leading the country. I think, Chinese history is written by the victors, and the victor is moral and wise and smart, and the loser is a scoundrel and dumb and pursuing the wrong policies. And there is a bit of that way of treating Hua Guofeng that I think is a little unfair, even in the more enlightened, more recent periods. Hua Guofeng, in my view, was really more willing to have new changes and support reform than some of the historical accounts suggest. but he didn't have the strong leadership ability, the strength, the determination, the willingness to bring back a lot of high-level officials and to clamp down on a lot of the people who had risen during the Cultural Revolution. He wasn't really ready to take those strong steps that Deng was. And so Deng was the one who really decided to be the one who should be the leader in December 78. So from that time on, Deng became the leader. When Mao took over from the Yan'an period, a lot of people described Mao as being willing to listen to people, and he had a lot of openness to new ideas. But they said after the 1950s, when he took over and had so many high positions and was chairman of this and chairman of that, and kids learned the songs that made Mao into kind of a mythical hero, that he lost his willingness to listen. And they were determined that Deng not do that. And so there were a couple of steps that were taken. One was that they would not name Deng chairman. He was not premier. He was not the head of the Communist Party. He was the deputy. They didn't want to give him all the open things so that he could become that much of a dictator. And they also said that there's one other person of about his standing in the party, Chen Yun, who ought to be involved in all important decisions. And so here the two of them at the third plenum in 1978 when they assumed power. So the two of them, it's not just a single person. Deng was the spokesman and the one who had the edge in public presentations, but the two of them worked together. Just before Deng went to the third plenum, he visited in October 78, he visited Japan. And here he met Emperor Hirohito. In Chinese history, the 2,500 years of rough contact between China and Japan, the first time a top Chinese leader met the emperor was in October 78 when Deng met Emperor Hirohito. The first time that they tried to deal with issues between the two countries, between such high level, was when Deng met them. And Deng decided that not only did they want Chinese help from Japan in science and technology, but to provide the basis for that, they had to have Chinese, have a broader understanding of Japanese culture. They want to have Japanese movies, popular TV shows, novels. And so during the 1980s, the Chinese were taught more about Chinese literature. In the 90s, after Tiananmen incident, when the Chinese were trying to train basic patriotic sentiments, they no longer talked about the good things that Japan had done. But Deng, in his period of the 1980s, tried to lay a basis for closer understanding in cooperation with Japan, and the Japanese could be quite generous during this. Here is Deng visiting a steel factory that became the model for Baoshan, the great steel factory in Shanghai. Deng was known as a person who wasn't overly talkative. They said about him, 不爱说话, and so when they asked him after he had ridden on the Shinkansen, what do you think about this? And he says, I'm quiet. It goes very fast. He was not going to be guilty of being a sycophant and doting on the wonders of the Western culture and saying all the horrible things about China, but he wanted to recognize that what they had accomplished, and we ought to recognize reality as reality. So that was Deng's approach. And so here he is visiting Tanaka Kakue, and the Chinese expression, when you drink the water, you remember who dug the well. And Tanaka Kakue was in a little trouble because of Lockheed, and he was in a scandal. But Deng said, well, he dug the well of resuming China-Japanese relations, so he wanted to visit Tanaka Kakue during his trip to Japan. In November 1978, Deng visited Southeast Asia. Here he is meeting Lee Kuan Yew, which I think was quite an impressive thing. Deng had visited Singapore in 1920 on his way to France, and he could see how terrible it was backward. Now he could see a modern Singapore, and clean and green and scientific. Not many of you are old enough as I am to remember in the 50s when a lot of us in university classes wondered, why is it that Confucianism will not allow modernization? Why is it that Confucianism has such drags that it's impossible for countries to modernize? You don't teach that anymore because it doesn't work. But here for Deng at that time, here was a place of people from Chinese ancestry who had really learned how to modernize and do things. And so he was very happy and very much inspired. The two became great friends and admirers. When Carter came to power in Washington, he wasn't quite ready immediately to normalize relations with China. But by the spring of 1978, he decided the politics was right that they begin, and he sent Brzezinski to Beijing. And one of the things that the two had in common was they both hated the Soviet Union. Zbig being a Polish, the son of a Polish diplomat who didn't have great love for the Soviet Union. And the two of them hit it off beautifully. And they began to prepare for the discussions over the next 6 months that would work out the details of normalization of relations. Even though Kissinger had started that, they hadn't been able to complete it. And Carter sent to Beijing Leonard Woodcock. Leonard Woodcock was a labor negotiator who was appreciated and respected both by labor and management. And he also had a certain amount of political clout in Washington to help with Congress after normalization, getting the measures approved. And here they are completing the negotiations in December 1975, celebrating the preparation for the announcement of normalization of relations. Nixon had started the opening, but it was only Woodcock's negotiation that was able to complete that with Deng Xiaoping. And when they asked Deng, when we were considering inviting a Chinese leader after normalization, Hua Guofeng was still called premier and chairman. And so we were cautious in the way we stated the invitation. We said we would, and Woodcock was instructed to tell Deng, he said that we would welcome a Chinese leader coming to the United States to celebrate normalization. They didn't say which leader. And as soon as Woodcock uttered those words, Deng says, "I'm ready to come. How about next month?" And so next month, indeed, Deng came to Washington, and it was a terrific success. The guy in the middle, Ji Chaoju, wrote a book called Man on Mao's Right, because he was interpreter for Mao and many others. He was a student at Harvard from 1948 to 1950 when he went back to China, and then became the key interpreter on the Chinese side for Deng and for many others in their key trips. And here we have the signing of normalization. Just as Tanaka Kakuei was visited in Tokyo, Deng said there was a former president of the United States who had not been back to the White House since he was pushed out after Watergate. And Deng said, when we think of who built the well, he built the well of the return on the American side. And so I want to thank him. And he told Carter he would like to have him invited to the White House. So the first time Nixon was invited back to the White House after he left, unceremoniously after Watergate, was when Deng came. And here they are having marvelous discussions in January 1979. When they went to Congress, We have a congressman from Massachusetts, ONeill, who was known for saying all politics is local. And after Deng was at Congress, at the White House, he went over to Congress and had a long talk with ONeill. And Deng was very much amused to hear all the stories that ONeill talked of how the Congress tries to block what the White House does. And then he ended by saying that we find that a good system because it blocks the kind of totalitarian leadership. And in the end, it's a safer, more democratic way to have our country is by having a complete separation of power between Congress and the White House. And Deng says, wouldn't work in China. He wanted a much more centralized program than ONeill thought was good for China. Deng visited various places. He had such a good time. Here he is at Henry Ford II in Atlanta, Ford plant. Here we are in the famous, getting ready now for the famous picture, as Deng visits a rodeo near Houston. And a lady rides up for that cowgirl, hands him the hat, he puts on the hat. And to Americans, this meant that maybe the guy's a communist, but he's human after all. So became kind of the friendly face of China in the United States. But Orville Schell, a journalist who was there, said that the picture had even more meaning in China because it sort of meant that all this stuff they'd been reading about the horrors of capitalism, you can forget about that now. America has a lot of good things you can learn from, you can enjoy, imbibe. And so this became a great symbol for the new period in which Chinese can begin to imbibe things. And here he is with Blumenthal, who came a few months later to open the Beijing embassy formally. Here we are. Bush Sr. had become quite friendly with Deng. It happened in 1975 when Deng had a lot of responsibilities in Beijing. In our liaison office, the kind of pre-embassy that we had there, the person who was in charge of the liaison office that year was Bush Sr. So Bush Sr. and Deng had quite a few meetings during that year. When Nixon was running for president, he made comments about wanting to normalize relations again with Taiwan, which Deng did not receive very enthusiastically. And there was a great deal of tension. But Bush Sr., I think, had a lot to do with getting that set straight. And so by the middle of the Reagan administration, he was able to arrange visiting Beijing. By the end of his visit with Deng, he stayed there over a week. He said, doesn't seem like a communist. I think what's quite remarkable about Deng is that he got along with Bush Sr., he got along with Reagan, he got along with Carter, people of very different political persuasions. He was still able to relate to in a very straightforward human way. So he had really quite remarkable ability to relate to many people. In 1982, when Thatcher was telling him about all the problems of government in Hong Kong, he was not about ready to announce that Britain could continue running Hong Kong after 97, and there was a little tension. But a couple of years later, Britain and China had reached an agreement of normalizing, working out the return of Hong Kong, and that China would take over. For Deng, the important thing was not just taking over, was preparing people for leadership. And so beginning in 84, when they reached the agreement, until 97, the 13 years, he basically thought of this as a training era. They would send down people, and they would identify people in Hong Kong who could learn, and who became kind of apprentices in various parts of the government. So that when they took over, it could be a relatively smooth transition. Here, Deng also wanted to join a lot of international organizations, the World Bank, here we are, the IMF, He invited the leaders in these various organizations to come with him. And some of you are old enough to remember that in the days before Wikipedia, we had things called encyclopedias. And at this time, Deng thought one quick way of self-starting, expanding Chinese knowledge to the outside world was of getting the Encyclopedia Britannica translated in Chinese. So here he is with Frank Gibney of Encyclopedia Britannica arranging for that translation. He also met a lot of business people, a lot of Hong Kong business people. Here he is, Li Ka-shing, perhaps Hong Kong's richest person. And here he is at ONeill. I've gone through the Deng Xiaoping Nianpu, the chronology. I can't remember his meeting any delegation led by an economist. Deng seemed to like people who had run things. He liked meeting government officials. He liked meeting business people who had really been in charge of things. He thought that was different than just reading theoretical stuff. And so he met a lot of these. So ONeill, as you know, who had the computer company at that time, was a quick way to learn about what China needed to do, get up on information technology. And here he is in the spring of 1989 with Senior President Bush. In 1988, he made some big mistakes about allowing inflation to go too high. And in 1989, however, he was very pleased that they were beginning to resume regular good relations with the Soviet Union. Deng really was convinced that it was in China's interest to cool down relations with the country so it didn't have to spend too much on the military. And so that when the Chinese could have cooled down relations with the Soviet Union, if the Soviet Union pulled out of Afghanistan, if Vietnam pulled out of Cambodia, and if they pulled back troops from the China's northern border, they could begin to have regular, better relations. And so when Gorbachev agreed to those, Deng then invited the world press. But when the world press got to Beijing, they found out that the student movements, the criticisms of demands for more democracy were much more interesting than the Gorbachev visit. So here we have the statue based on the Statue of Liberty, the masses, and Deng felt that it was the order was beginning to fall apart. The citizens had supported the resistors rather than the troops, and so Deng sent in the troops. Here the tanks rolling in, and here we are in Brent Scowcroft. Bush Sr. wrote at that time, I thought, a very touching letter to Deng. He said, "Because I know you personally and know how much both of us care and believe in the importance of our relationship, I'm writing you this letter. I realize that we have very different attitudes. We are being very tough and showing our displeasure at the way you treat human rights. We have found in our country that democracy and respect for human rights are very basic to our country. We're not doing this because we want to weaken China. I want to keep up relations with China during these very difficult times. I'd like to send a representative." Deng immediately replied, "I'll welcome the representative." And so Brent Scowcroft came, and the two countries sort of kept their relationship during that difficult time. Deng tried to keep things quiet, and this picture, swimming in the ocean, was circulated widely after that time. The oceans were there before, the oceans are still there. Deng said that before long, foreign businessmen will be telling their countries, we can't neglect the China market. We have to somehow adapt our policies so that we can resume our economic relations. And within several years, all these sanctions will be greatly diminished. I think most people would agree that he was probably quite correct.
Here is Jiang Zemin, whom he selected as his successor. Here they are at the Party Congress in 1992, where he's completely passing on the mantle and deciding, he had successfully decided that people should have term offices, not serve for a whole life. He was a little older than officials would be later. He was already 88 when he retired, but he made the point that we want term offices, not position for life. And so here he is stepping down. After he stepped down, he walked around his garden in 1992 to 1997. And here he is after he died. This is the service for Deng in China. And here we are at Jiang Zemin giving a memorial speech. And here we are at the UN Security Council, the UN where Deng had given his speech, recognition that as a world leader, he played a very important role in bringing China back into the world stage. Thank you very much.